If you were brought up by parents in the 1970s, their way of thinking was completely different from the world we live in now. You can feel it in the way they describe their own youth, and in how they act when today's parents get worried about things they used to ignore. They easily dismiss things that people now see as risky. There was a quiet belief back then that children are much more capable than anyone gives them credit for. Whether you are trying to figure out why they raised you that way, or you were one of those parents following your own gut, what you are about to read will change how you see everything. This is because 1970s parents followed a mental rulebook that created something very unique. It is true that they raised some of the strongest and most independent children in modern times, but there is a side to this that people rarely mention. That same way of thinking molded you in ways that are much deeper than just happy old memories. Being independent came with specific ways of bonding with others. Being tough changed how you handle your feelings. Having freedom meant that some things were never talked about or fixed. By the end of this, you will understand both sides of the story. That idea that kids should be tough and left to their own devices didn't just appear out of nowhere. Your parents were under pressures that decided not only how much freedom they gave you, but also how emotionally close they could be while giving it. Let's look at your mother first. She was stuck in a mental trap that didn't even have a name yet. The women's rights movement was happening all around her, telling her she could have a career, want more than just housework, and have an identity beyond being a wife and mother. However, the world's expectations hadn't actually changed to match those ideas. She was still expected to keep a perfect house, have dinner ready on time, and act like it was all easy. Society told her she could do anything, while also judging her if she didn't do everything perfectly. You can work, but don't let the house get messy. Have goals, but don't ignore your kids. Be strong, but don't make your husband feel weak. This is where your freedom comes in. Sending you outside for hours wasn't just because they thought kids needed to be independent. For some mothers, it was the only way to handle those impossible demands. The lack of attention that made you strong was also sometimes her way of surviving. Maybe your mom was loving one day and totally distant the next. Maybe she got angry over small things because she was carrying so much stress. Maybe she seemed bitter in ways you didn't understand as a child, because you didn't know she was sad about opportunities she was told she had but couldn't actually reach. Mothers who worked had it even harder. There was no paid time off for new moms, no flexible hours, and people judged them from every side. That belief that kids were tough became the excuse these mothers used to go to work without feeling crushed by guilt. And your father's experience was almost the exact opposite. While your mother was being pulled in many directions, your father's role was very narrow. He was the breadwinner, the one who gave the orders, and the boss of the house. His whole value was based on earning money and being respected. Those roles didn't leave much room for showing deep feelings. But here is the link. That same idea that kids need to solve their own problems and that struggling makes you better came from how those men were raised. Men in the 1970s were never taught how to talk about emotions. They weren't told to look at their feelings or show when they were hurt. That was a type of training they received since they were little boys. Don't cry, be tough, act like a man. Feelings were seen as a sign of weakness, and weakness was not allowed. So when your father let you climb a tree without watching over you, or watched you solve a problem alone, or didn't rush to hug you every time you fell, he wasn't being mean. He was doing exactly what was done to him. The same hardness that was forced on him, he was now giving to you in the form of freedom. Your father might have come home and sat in silence, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to show he cared. That distance wasn't because he didn't like you. He showed love by paying the bills, by being there, and by keeping the family together. A simple hand on your shoulder or showing up to your game without saying a word were the only ways he knew how to show love. This came from a real place. Your grandparents lived through the Great Depression and World War II. They raised children to believe that hiding your feelings was a way to survive, and being tough was a necessity. You didn't talk about your feelings because talking didn't fix the problem. But that emotional distance created something else, something people forget when they talk about the good old days of the 70s. That same hands-off style created room for things to happen in those homes that no one talked about. These things were common, but they were serious enough to change how people act today. Drinking too much wasn't called an addiction. It was just how dad acted up for a long day. Kids learned to check their parents' mood by how many empty bottles there were, or the sound of ice in a glass. They became very sensitive to small changes because things were unpredictable. Hitting kids as punishment wasn't questioned. Belts, wooden spoons, and slapping weren't called abuse. They were called discipline. When a father hit a child for talking back, the neighbors usually agreed that kids needed to learn respect. There was no talk about how this taught lessons about power and fear. Fights between parents happened right in front of the kids without anyone thinking about the damage. Parents yelled at the dinner table. Doors were slammed. Sometimes things broke while kids sat on the stairs listening, learning that this was what adult relationships looked like, that anger and disrespect were just part of being married. Mental health issues were totally ignored. Feeling sad was just being tired. Being anxious was just being nervous. Your mother's distance wasn't seen as depression, and your father's temper wasn't seen as a mental health struggle. These problems existed without any help or even an admission that something was wrong. And getting a divorce carried such a bad reputation that kids often felt ashamed if their parents split up. There was no family counseling, just moving between houses, and children often felt like their parents' failed marriage was their fault. But what made it worse was the silence. Children went through these things without any adult helping them understand what it meant. No one said that dad's drinking wasn't your fault. No one explained that the hitting was because the parents couldn't control their own anger, not because you were a bad kid. So kids did what they had to do.
They figured things out with what they knew. They learned to be extremely independent because they couldn't always rely on adults. They learned to hide their feelings because showing them led to trouble. They learned to manage the moods of the people around them just to stay safe. This is the other side of that independence. People praise that self-reliance, but it grew out of need, not just freedom. It was the ability to do everything alone because asking for help wasn't an option. That style also applied to how rules worked. Your parents didn't just hide their feelings, they built a system where you had to obey without question. Saying, "because I said so," wasn't lazy to them, it was their entire philosophy. Kids weren't supposed to know the reasons, they were just supposed to do as they were told. Asking why wasn't seen as being smart, it was seen as being rude and had to be stopped. Your parents truly believed that kids who followed orders would grow up to be adults who did well in jobs, the military, or marriage. They were getting you ready for a world where the people in charge had all the power, and your job was to follow. A clear chain of command made them feel safe. Strict rules meant they knew what to expect, which felt like safety in homes that were otherwise messy. But that same system might have changed how you deal with people in charge today. You might have learned that your opinion doesn't matter, or that the person with the power is always right. Some of you might have become people pleasers, learning to give people what they want before they even ask. You might be able to tell what others want with amazing accuracy, but you aren't sure what you want for yourself. Others might